August 17, 1942. Detroit Tank Arsenal, Michigan. A welder named Charles E. Sorensen wiped sweat from his eyes as molten sparks rained around him. To the foreman, he was the factory's eccentric, an industrial savant whose sketches looked like madness on paper. That morning, in the roar of presses and pneumatic hammers, Sorensen was about to unveil a contraption that everyone in management had already rejected. A gun, he called it, though it fired no bullets, only molten metal. The line chief stared as Sorensen clamped a crude steel tube to the hull of an unfinished M4 Sherman. Compressed oxygen hissed, the acetylene torch ignited, and his hybrid tool spat a white-blue arc that fused two armor plates in seconds. He turned, grinning through a visor blackened with soot. "This gun can weld a tank faster than 10 men, he shouted over the compressors. The supervisors exchanged uneasy looks. Automation, in 1942, was a word most welders feared and most engineers distrusted. At the time, Detroit Arsenal was producing one tank every 55 minutes, a miracle by the standards of 1939, yet hopelessly slow for the armies now burning through machines in Tunisia and the Soviet steppe. Each Sherman required over 1/200 manual welds, consuming more than 6,000 man-hours of skilled labor. Every joint was a potential bottleneck, every bead of steel a test of human endurance. The War Production Board estimated that if welding efficiency could be improved by even 10%, the United States could build an additional 5,000 tanks per year without adding a single worker. Sorensen's gun did more than that. By using a pressurized wire feed arc instead of torch flame and filler rods, it automated the process. The principle was simple and beautiful. A continuous spool of steel wire fed through a nozzle, while current and gas flow created a self-shielding arc. What had taken 10 minutes could now be done in 20 seconds. But to the production managers, it looked unstable, too hot, too new, too dangerous. "Stick to the torch, Charlie," they told him. "We don't need mad science slowing the line." He kept testing in secret after hours, welding scrap hulls and broken gun mounts until the midnight whistle blew. Other workers laughed, calling him the mad welder who played with lightning. But his notes show something else: measured heat inputs, current curves, and metallurgical graphs drawn with engineer-level discipline. In time, that rejected gun would be known as gas-metal arc welding, MIG, metal inert gas, and it would save more than 50 million man-hours across American war industry. But on that August morning, it was still just a curiosity in the corner of a factory where speed meant survival. The din of riveters drowned his experiment. A foreman walked past without glancing, clipboard pressed tight to his chest, counting welders and quotas. Outside, a poster showed a grim-faced Rosie the riveter and the words, "We can do it." Inside, one man was trying to do it faster than anyone thought possible. No one believed him yet. But history rarely starts with belief. It starts with a spark, an idea, and someone willing to hold the torch long after others have gone home. What would you have done? Trusted the math or the man everyone called crazy? Tell us below. Because history, after all, is written by those who refuse to stay silent. September 3rd, 1942. The Packard Engine Division, Detroit. The war had turned factories into battlefields of production. Engineers, draftsmen, and welders worked beneath banners reading, "Speed is armor." Every hour lost meant a Sherman or a B-24 that would never reach the front. Amid this frenzy, Charles Sorensen's mad gun found its first unexpected ally, not among the foremen, but among the tool makers who stayed late after shifts. They had seen him work in the shadows, a welder bending electric arcs like a sculptor shaping clay. He called it continuous feed welding and claimed it could replace the torch entirely. The idea spread quietly through the night crews. Some tried it on scrap exhaust manifolds and broken engine mounts. The results were impossible to ignore. Joints that held tighter, cleaner, and faster than anything done by torch or rivet. Within weeks, whispers about Sorensen's lightning gun reached the engineers upstairs. In those days, welding was still half craft, half alchemy. Each bead was judged by the ear. The pitch of molten steel told veterans if the heat was right. The standard oxyacetylene torch consumed fuel by the ton and demanded artisanship the factories no longer had time for. The Army's Ordnance Department had been begging for faster techniques. Every bomber engine built in Detroit used over 1,500 separate welds. Every landing craft required hundreds more. Rivets were heavy, slow, and prone to fatigue cracks under vibration. On September 8th, Sorensen presented his prototype to a skeptical review board. His test rig, a repurposed cutting torch connected to a variable current generator, looked like a shop experiment. But when he pulled the trigger, a steady arc roared into life, feeding molten wire with a rhythmic hiss. In less than 40 seconds, he fused two 3/8-inch plates edge to edge, a task that normally took 6 minutes by torch. The metallurgist inspected the seam. No porosity, no slag, uniform penetration. One engineer from the War Production Board leaned over the specimen, speechless. "What shielding gas?" he asked finally. Sorensen tapped the cylinder beside him. "Argon. It keeps the oxygen out. The weld protects itself." It sounded like witchcraft. The board dismissed the demonstration as a laboratory trick. Argon, they argued, was too expensive, the feed wire too delicate, the power control unstable for mass production. The minutes recorded from that meeting survive in Packard's archives. Process deemed unfit for field manufacturing. He smiled when he read it. "Good," he told a machinist friend. "They only reject things they don't understand yet." For months he refined the design, changing polarity, adjusting wire speed, testing different shielding gases. A handful of engineers joined him quietly, drawn by the promise of something that could change everything. By December 1942, they had reduced the process to a single compact unit, a portable welder with a wire spool built into the handle. They called it the Model 1A Continuous Arc Gun. The first production trial took place not in Detroit, but in Cleveland, at the Lincoln Electric plant. A team of women welders, new to the trade, were trained to use the device in under 30 minutes. In a single 8-hour shift, they completed 1 oz 2/200 inches of perfect seam weld, the equivalent of 3 experienced men working a full day with torches. The foreman watching that test later wrote, "It was the first time I realized machinery could learn the work of men." What followed was quiet revolution. By early 1943, Sorensen's method had been adopted experimentally on B-24 bomber engine mounts at Ford's Willow Run plant. The numbers stunned management. A mount that once required 6 welders in 5 hours could be finished by one operator in 40 minutes. The plant's production rose by 18% in a single month, without hiring an additional worker. The mad gun had proved itself. Yet few outside the factories knew his name. Wartime secrecy buried individual credit beneath the collective title Gas Metal Arc Process. Reports to Washington listed it simply as welding, automatic, inert gas shielded. But the impact rippled across every assembly line. In tank plants, the process cut hull assembly time from 12 days to 4. In aircraft factories, it reduced welding defects by 60%. Across the U.S. industrial front, the estimated labor saved reached into tens of millions of hours. Enough manpower to build an entire army of machines. And through it all, the man who had been called crazy never patented the invention. His notes show no design claims, no royalties, no legal filings, just columns of voltage data and weld penetration diagrams scrawled in pencil. "If it helps win the war," he wrote in the margin of one page, "it belongs to everyone." By the time the Ordnance Department realized what they had dismissed, the mad welder's rejected gun was already changing the physics of production. It had turned heat into labor, electricity into victory. Outside, snow was falling on the factory roofs of Detroit, muffling the sound of machines that no longer slept. Inside, the arcs burned brighter than ever, silent weapons in a war fought not by soldiers, but by sparks. The engineers would soon carry it beyond tanks and bombers, into shipyards, into pipe mills, into the heart of an industrial transformation no one yet understood. And when they did, the name of the man who started it all would vanish into the smoke, leaving only the glow of molten steel where disbelief once stood. January 10th, 1943. River Rouge Plant, Dearborn, Michigan. The world's largest factory did not sleep. Its furnaces burned red through the night, illuminating the river in molten reflection. Conveyors moved like arteries, carrying life into bombers, tanks, and trucks, and buried deep inside Building B, behind welding curtains that pulsed like orange sails. Sorensen's invention was being tested for the first time under full production conditions. Ford's engineers called it Process 1031. They didn't say Sorensen or MiG. In wartime America, names didn't matter as much as output per minute. The Army Ordnance contract required Ford to deliver one B-24 Liberator bomber every 63 minutes. That meant 24,000 welds, each one a potential failure point. For months, inspectors had logged microscopic cracks in engine frames, wheel wells, and gun mounts. The new automatic arc gun promised to change that, if it could survive the tempo of industrial combat. The test began at 500 hours. Rows of women in overalls, production soldiers, they called themselves, took positions along the jig lines. Each held a hand-sized welder, humming softly, a cable feeding from an overhead reel. When the signal horn sounded, they pressed the triggers. 1,000 arcs bloomed in unison, white blue light flickering across the ceiling like distant artillery. The molten bead ran smooth and flawless, shielding gas whispering over the metal. Inspectors measured seam length and surface integrity. No slag, no warping. The welds were perfect. By noon, the plant's welding department head, Ernest Kanzler, calculated something extraordinary. The same section of fuselage now required 68% fewer man-hours. Across the month, it would free enough skilled workers to open an entire new assembly line. "It's like adding a factory without building one," he wrote in his report to the War Production Board. The data spread quickly through Washington's wartime network. The Office of Production Research classified the process as critical technology. Within weeks, blueprints for the continuous feed arc welder were circulating to shipyards, tank arsenals, and aircraft plants. Engineers at the Kaiser shipyards in Richmond installed the first naval-scale adaptation. There, the results were staggering. A Liberty ship's hull seam that once required 3 shifts of welders could now be completed in 8 hours. Everywhere it went, skepticism turned to awe. In Buffalo, Curtis Wright used the new process to weld aluminum engine mounts, previously considered too thin for electric arc welding. In Chicago, International Harvester applied it to artillery carriages. At the Bethlehem Steel Shipyard in Baltimore, supervisors reported their first day without a single cracked weld failure. "The machine never gets tired," one welder said. "It just asks for wire and current." By mid-1943, the system had saved an estimated 22 million man-hours. By the end of the war, the number would surpass 50 million, the equivalent labor of 25,000 full-time workers over 4 years. behind those numbers lay something deeper, a shift in how America built. Factories were no longer workshops. They were networks of electricity, automation, and precision. The war had forced human intuition to merge with machine logic. Still, few outside the walls of those plants ever saw the faces behind the torches. The newsreels showed women smiling beside aircraft fuselages, sparks flying like fireworks. The captions read, "Efficiency through ingenuity." No mention of the welder who had first defied his superiors, or the nights he spent testing until his gloves burned through. In April 1943, the process reached the shipyards at Pascagoula, Mississippi. The U.S. Maritime Commission recorded a milestone. A new Liberty ship launched every 5.6 days. Rivets were giving way to welds. Sparks had replaced hammers. The weld guns, once dismissed as too experimental, now hung from every gantry. Each arc consumed electricity equal to 10 homes, but it was still cheaper than feeding the old torch teams. Technicians began calling the sound of the arc the hum of victory. It was constant, hypnotic, a chorus of energy that stretched from Detroit to Long Beach. Every weld told the same story, that speed and precision could coexist if humans trusted machines to share their work. Sorensen, meanwhile, remained in Detroit, overseeing tests for even thicker armor plate. His private notebooks, now in the archives of the American Welding Society, record a line dated March the 19th, 1943. Arc length 5/8 inch, current 260 amperes. Penetration perfect. The torch sings when you get it right. He never presented another formal paper. He didn't need to. The factories were his proof. By summer, even the skeptics at the Ordnance Department had reversed course. Reports to Congress mentioned massive labor savings in armored vehicle assembly through inert gas welding. General Motors credited the method for cutting M10 tank destroyer assembly time by 30%. The Bureau of Ships listed it as the most significant advance in fabrication since the electric motor. But Sorensen's story didn't end in fame. He declined offers to commercialize the welder, insisting it remain public domain technology for industry. His only reward was a single line in the 1945 Ordnance Review. Improved welding methods have materially accelerated production. By the time that sentence was printed, the glow of those factory arcs had spread across an entire continent. Bridges, pipelines, aircraft, refineries, all were being built using his once-rejected design. In Detroit, when workers clocked out at midnight, they left behind a hum that never stopped. The lights in the welding bays stayed on. Machines fed themselves wire through the night, their arcs pulsing with mechanical rhythm, proof that one man's defiance had rewritten industrial warfare. No one in those factories knew his name, but they all knew the sound, that electric hiss, that rhythmic heartbeat of molten steel. It was the sound of human hands, learning to work at the speed of current. And before the war was over, that sound would change not just how weapons were made, but how entire nations would build their futures. June 1943, Richmond, California. Under the glare of the West Coast sun, the Kaiser shipyards looked less like a factory and more like a living organism. Miles of welding cables snaked across concrete docks. Sparks erupted in synchronized rhythm as thousands of men and women bent over ship frames, their faces ghostly behind masks of green glass. Every 2 weeks, a new Liberty ship slid into the bay, a miracle of modern industry made possible by a tool no one outside the war effort had ever seen, Sorensen's continuous feed arc gun. At first, the shipyards had resisted. Traditional welders claimed the new guns would ruin structural integrity. Some refused to touch them, saying the arc burned too hot, too clean, leaving seams that couldn't possibly hold against the Pacific's waves. The Navy's Inspection Bureau sent metallurgists to test the first hulls welded with the process. They expected cracks. They found none. In fatigue tests, the new seams lasted 42% longer before fracture than torch welds. Kaiser's engineers wasted no time. Within weeks, entire crews were retrained. The old torch carts vanished from the yards. Each welder now carried a compact handpiece connected by cables to the power reels overhead. What had once required teams of 3 could now be done by 1. The shift saved thousands of hours per vessel, enough to compress construction schedules to a fraction of their pre-war length. In 1941, a Liberty ship took 240 days to complete. By mid-1943, the average had dropped below 50. At the peak of production, one ship was finished every 4.5 days. The savings were not only measured in hours, but in human cost. Before the new process, welders endured searing heat and oxygen-depleted air for hours on end. Many collapsed from exhaustion. Some went blind from arc flash. The continuous feed gun required less manual effort, less torch handling, and fewer re-welds. Industrial accidents in Kaiser's yards fell by nearly 1/3. For the first time, the welder's arc became not just a symbol of war production, but of survival. Across the continent, the same revolution was unfolding in ways even the War Department could scarcely track. At the Pullman plant in Chicago, tank turrets rolled down assembly lines, welded by machines that could complete a full circumferential seam in under 3 minutes. In Pittsburgh, the American Bridge Company adapted the technique to structural steel, creating bridge sections for the Alaskan Highway that were assembled in record time. Even locomotive manufacturers joined the movement. Baldwin Locomotive Works used gas metal arc welding to construct steam frames that would power the trains hauling the Allies' war freight. But it was in the aircraft factories where the transformation became art. At the Vega division of Lockheed, engineers modified Sorensen's Welder to fuse thin aluminum alloys without distortion, a feat previously thought impossible. The same women who had once riveted fuselages now guided arcs across gleaming surfaces, each seam a glowing line of victory. For the first time, aircraft skin could be welded continuously rather than stitched together by rivets. Every ounce saved meant longer range, higher altitude, and greater payload. The impact rippled outward. Every industrial plant that adopted the method reported the same pattern: fewer workers producing more output with greater precision. The War Production Board called it the silent multiplier. It multiplied effort without demanding more hands, multiplied speed without sacrificing strength. It gave America the one resource no enemy could reclaim: time. The military saw it too. Reports from the Army Service Forces described the process as critical to sustained output under manpower constraints. By autumn 1943, with millions of men overseas, every saved hour meant another tank, another gun, another ship delivered on schedule. Economists later estimated that by year's end, the process had conserved enough labor to man 30 full infantry divisions. Not an all recognition came quietly. In November 1943, Popular Mechanics published a single paragraph noting a mysterious new welding method used in tank factories, capable of reducing man-hours dramatically. The article mentioned no inventor's name. Wartime secrecy still blanketed every industrial innovation, but inside engineering circles, word spread fast. They called it MIG, Metal Inert Gas Welding, a name that would outlive the war and eventually define an entire era of manufacturing. At night, when the shipyards fell silent except for the lapping of water against steel hulls, the welders sometimes left their guns humming idly on the benches, tips glowing orange in the dark. Those sounds, faint, steady, and mechanical, became the new heartbeat of the arsenal of democracy. The ships built with them carried troops, fuel, and hope across oceans. Many would never return, sunk by torpedoes or storms, but the method that made them would outlast them all. In Washington, analysts at the Bureau of Labor Statistics began compiling post-war forecasts. Automation, one report read, has entered industry by necessity, not design. The tools of this war will define the peace that follows, and they were right. For what began as one welder's defiance in a Detroit workshop had evolved into a quiet revolution, one that would not end with victory, but merely pause long enough for the world to understand what had changed. When the war ended, the headlines spoke of generals, admirals, and campaigns. Few mentioned the factories. Fewer still remembered the man with the rejected gun. But deep in every welded seam of every ship and plane that came home, his fingerprint was there, invisible, enduring, and fused forever into the steel that saved a generation. August 1945. The war was over. The smokestacks that had burned without rest for 4 years began to cool, their flames shrinking to faint blue tongues above the horizon. Across America's industrial heartland, the sound of hammers, presses, and welding arcs faded into a hum of exhausted silence. For millions of workers, victory felt like relief mixed with fear. What would become of the machines built for war when the world no longer needed tanks and ships and bombers? In Detroit, Charles Sorensen walked the floor of the now quiet assembly hall. The same bays that had once assembled B-24 wings now stood filled with half-finished automobiles. His wire-feed welding guns lay stacked in crates, stamped "Property of War Department." He touched one of them, the paint flaking from its handle, and smiled faintly. What had been a weapon of production was about to become the heart of peace. Within months, industrial engineers from the War Production Board began transferring wartime technologies to civilian industries. At the top of the list, gas metal arc welding, automatic inert gas shielded. Shipyard supervisors, aircraft manufacturers, and automobile companies scrambled to adapt the process for peacetime use. For the first time, engineers saw how the same principle that had welded armor and hulls could join pipelines, power plants, and bridges. In October 1945, the American Welding Society held its first post-war convention in Chicago. The keynote lecture, delivered by Dr. William Spratigan of General Electric, read like a manifesto for the future. "The war taught us speed," he said, "but it also taught us precision born of necessity. The machine that saves hours in wartime will save lives in peace." On the exhibit floor, Sorensen's continuous feed arc guns were displayed beside prototype atomic reactors and jet engines. Few visitors realized that all three technologies shared a single idea: control of energy through automation. By 1946, gas metal arc welding was spreading across industries faster than any other mechanical process of its era. The pipeline boom in Texas adopted it first, fusing thousands of kilometers of oil lines that would feed America's post-war economy. Railroad manufacturers followed, using it to weld frames that could withstand years of vibration without cracking. Even construction companies embraced it. The same electric hiss once heard in tank factories now echoed through skyscraper foundations in New York and Chicago. The savings were measurable, almost surgical. A 1947 Bureau of Labor report estimated that factories using the process had reduced total fabrication time by 38%, maintenance costs by 25%, and defect rates by more than half. Every second counted. The United States had emerged from the war as the world's industrial giant, but it was Sorensen's machine, his mad gun, that made such dominance sustainable. Meanwhile, veterans returning from overseas filled the trade schools that had once trained wartime welders. The GI Bill funded new welding programs nationwide. Thousands of men who had never seen a factory before 1941 now held certificates in a technology that barely existed 5 years earlier. They called themselves ArcMen, a quiet brotherhood who could trace their craft back to the spark of one welder's stubborn belief. In 1948, General Motors introduced the first fully welded automobile frame using the process, the Cadillac Series 62. Reviewers noted its rigid structure, reduced weight, and unprecedented safety. Few readers understood that the real innovation lay not in the chrome or the styling, but in the invisible seams beneath the paint. Each one had been laid by an automatic welder, working at 10 times the speed of human hands. The post-war boom made those seams the backbone of modern America. Bridges, refineries, aircraft, even farm machinery carried the quiet signature of Sorensen's process. Welders spoke of the new era as if it were a religion, the electric gospel. In 1949, Lincoln Electric's internal newsletter celebrated its 10,000th MiG unit shipped. Beneath the photo of a smiling foreman stood the caption, "Born in War, Built for Peace." Sorensen himself refused interviews. He disliked the growing myth around his invention, insisting it had been a collective effort of desperate times. But the truth followed him nonetheless. In 1950, the American Welding Society awarded him the Golden Arc Medal for contributions to industrial innovation in national defense. The inscription was simple: for giving time back to those who had none. By then, the technology had already leapt beyond anything he could have imagined. Metallurgists at MIT were using MiG systems to weld experimental alloys for jet aircraft. At Oak Ridge, atomic engineers welded uranium casings with inert gas arcs so pure that even air couldn't contaminate the seam. On the highways, truck plants adopted continuous feed welding to assemble trailers and chassis at record speed. Each year, the circle widened. The irony was inescapable. What had begun as a rejected gun, a dangerous curiosity tested after hours in a Detroit factory, had become the most widely used welding process in human history. It changed not only how things were built, but how people thought about building. Factories once divided by trade, welders here, riveters there, machinists beyond, began to merge into single fluid systems of automation. The war had forced human beings to synchronize with machines. Peace made that synchronization permanent. By the end of the decade, the white-blue arc of gas-metal welding was as common as neon lights in every city's skyline. It flickered behind shipyard cranes, danced in refinery shadows, and hummed through the night along new expressways stretching across America. Charles Sorensen rarely spoke about what his invention had become. When asked, he simply said, "It started with trying to make a tank faster. It ended with making everything else faster too." The story of his mad gun was no longer just about saving man-hours. It was about how an idea born in the noise and desperation of war had become the silent architect of the modern world. February 1951. Snow fell over the port of Bremen, dusting the hulls of half-finished cargo ships being rebuilt for a broken nation. Inside a converted warehouse, German engineers watched as an American technician demonstrated a welding process unlike anything they had seen before. The machine hissed softly, feeding a wire that melted into a perfect silver bead under a cone of bluish light. It required no hammering, no slag removal, no multiple passes. The Americans called it MIG, metal inert gas welding. In just a few minutes, the engineer joined two steel plates with a seam smoother than anything Germany's pre-war shipyards could produce. One operator replaces 5, he explained through an interpreter, and he doesn't tire. For the post-war nations, rebuilding their industries from rubble, this was not just technology. It was resurrection. The Marshall Plan had begun channeling billions of dollars into European reconstruction. With it came American machinery, blueprints, and know-how. Alongside tractors and turbines came crates marked industrial welding equipment, Model 1A. Each crate carried the same Detroit-born principle that had transformed wartime production. By 1952, shipyards in Hamburg, Le Havre, and Glasgow were using gas metal arc welders to rebuild entire fleets. Britain's Ministry of Supply credited the method for cutting repair times of Liberty ships by more than half. But it wasn't only the West that noticed. Across the Iron Curtain, Soviet industrial planners studied every fragment of captured American machinery they could find. Wartime Lend-Lease tanks and aircraft were disassembled and analyzed. Soviet engineers quickly understood that the secret to America's wartime productivity wasn't only mass production, it was automated joining. In 1946, the Peyton Institute of Electric Welding in Kiev began experimenting with similar techniques, developing their own version, automatic arc welding under flux, directly inspired by reports of American inert gas systems. By the early 1950s, Soviet industry had adopted it on a massive scale. Their shipyards along the Black Sea built submarines and tankers using continuous arc processes derived from Sorensen's principle. In an ironic twist, both sides of the Cold War now competed using the same idea born from one man's defiance in Detroit. In the United States, MiG technology became a tool of prosperity. In the Soviet Union, it became a symbol of socialist efficiency. The contest for industrial supremacy would be fought not only with rockets and bombers, but through the precision of every weld, the integrity of every joint, the speed of every assembly line. Back home, Sorensen watched these developments from a distance. He had retired from Ford by then, spending most of his days consulting for the War Production Board's Civilian Advisory Branch. Journalists called him the father of modern welding. He disliked the title, preferring to call himself just an engineer who hated wasted time. When asked what he thought of the Soviets adapting his process, he simply replied, "If both sides build better because of it, maybe we win something larger than a war." Throughout the 1950s, MiG technology became the backbone of global industry. In Japan, the Nippon Steel Works adopted it to rebuild rail networks destroyed by bombing. In France, the process was used to fabricate nuclear reactor vessels. In Canada, hydroelectric plants rose from mountain valleys, their penstocks welded by arcs bright enough to be seen for miles at night. Everywhere it spread, it carried the same fingerprint of efficiency. The equations were simple but profound. Less labor, more precision, higher throughput. By 1955, more than 200,000 MiG welding units were operating worldwide. The International Welding Journal called it the single most transformative innovation since the electric motor. Even art and architecture absorbed its influence. Sculptors like David Smith and later Richard Serra used gas metal arc welding to create massive steel works that seemed impossible a decade earlier. The same process that had built tanks and ships now gave form to monuments and bridges. The Cold War only intensified the pace of innovation. As both superpowers raced to build faster jets, larger rockets, and deeper submarines, the demand for welds of absolute perfection drove metallurgy to new frontiers. American aerospace engineers modified MiG technology into a high-frequency variant capable of welding aluminum alloys for jet fuselages. Soviet counterparts developed vacuum chamber arc welding for spacecraft. In a paradox worthy of history's irony, Every major milestone of the space race, from America's Mercury capsules to the Soviet Vostok, relied on the principle conceived by a man who had once been dismissed as a welder with dangerous ideas. By the late 1950s, Sorensen's rejected gun had reshaped not just factories, but the logic of progress itself. Industry was no longer a battle of manpower. It was a contest of precision, control, and time. He received one final letter that decade from a former colleague, now working at General Dynamics. "Charlie, the same arc you showed us in '42 is welding submarine hulls rated for 10,000 feet. The gun you built for tanks is now sealing the walls of the deep ocean." When Sorensen read it, he set the letter down without a word. He had no patent royalties, no foundation in his name, no monument in Washington, but his work had reached both poles of the planet, shaping peace and preparing for another kind of war, the war of ideas, speed, and industry. By the dawn of the 1960s, that war was well underway. The same hum of current that once echoed through Detroit and Richmond now vibrated through shipyards in Murmansk and factories in Nagoya. The world had inherited his arc, and it refused to go dark. October 1958. The roar of war had long faded, but in America's factories, the hum of current still carried the rhythm of conflict, not of destruction, but of endurance. Across the Midwest, hundreds of thousands of workers stood behind the same welding curtains that had once concealed the forges of victory. Yet something fundamental had changed. Where once sweat and muscle had defined labor, now precision, patience, and understanding of machines determined worth. The welders of this new era no longer swung torches with calloused hands. They guided arcs like artists tracing light. Women who had entered factories as temporary help in 1942 were now supervisors, instructors, and engineers. The war had trained them to see machinery as an extension of human will, and they refused to surrender that knowledge. At a General Electric training center in Schenectady, rows of female trainees learned to adjust current flow, wire speed, and gas ratios on MIG systems that traced their lineage directly to Sorensen's first gun. The instructors called them arc pilots. A film reel from that year shows a young woman adjusting her helmet, eyes fixed on the steady pulse of white-blue light. The narrator's voice says, "This is no longer brute labor. This is guided energy." To the generation raised in the factories of the 1950s, welding became more than work. It became language. Each seam spoke of discipline, every spark a sentence in the growing story of a mechanized civilization. The process that had once terrified skilled craftsmen now inspired a new pride rooted in mastery of precision. A welder no longer built one tank, one ship, or one car. He, or she, built the idea of modernity itself. Sociologists later called this the arc age. Productivity soared, wages rose, and factory culture evolved around the hum of automation. In Detroit, welders earned more than machinists. In Pittsburgh, a new generation of metallurgists emerged, men and women who could read current flow like musicians read sheet music. The arc welder became a symbol of human control over industrial chaos, the spark that linked imagination to creation. But for many veterans of the wartime assembly lines, progress carried an undertone of loss. The camaraderie of human labor, the sound of hammers, the rhythm of a dozen torches moving together, was replaced by the solitary hiss of a single operator and his machine. "The factory got quieter," one foreman remembered. "Too quiet. You could hear your own thoughts, and not all of them were good." Automation had given man power beyond measure, but it had also begun to separate him from the sweat that once defined pride. The hands that had once burned with effort were now insulated by gloves and guided by current regulators. The machine no longer obeyed muscle, it obeyed understanding. And yet, beneath this transformation lay the same defiance that had birthed Sorensen's invention. It was still about refusing limits, refusing to believe that something could not be done faster, stronger, or better. The same spirit that had welded Liberty ships in record time now welded the bones of skyscrapers, jetliners, and nuclear reactors. Every arc carried a trace of that early madness, the belief that the impossible was merely unfinished. In 1960, the American Welding Society produced a commemorative film titled The Builders of Light. It opened with black and white footage of a Detroit welder in 1942, Sorensen himself, though uncredited, igniting his prototype gun. The film cut to gleaming post-war skylines, bridges, and aircraft, all built with the descendants of that same tool. The narrator's voice declared, "The hands that held the torch of victory now hold the torch of progress." Not all nations celebrated it so serenely. In the Soviet Union, propaganda posters depicted heroic welders framed against the rising sun, their arcs shining like comets. "Our light builds the future," one read. In both East and West, the welder became the new icon of human mastery, a secular saint of industry. Behind the symbolism, however, the human cost remained real. Welding was safer than torch work, but still perilous. Electric arcs burned through clothing, fumes filled lungs, ultraviolet light scarred eyes. Many of the men and women who had powered the war's industrial miracle carried the marks of that labor into old age. A welder's hands, even decades later, bore tiny metallic scars, invisible except under sunlight, fragments of their craft fused into their skin. In 1962, the Smithsonian Institution opened an exhibit titled The Invisible Weapons of World War II. Among the jet engines and radar sets was a single object resting under glass, a compact metal cylinder, battered and stained, its copper nozzle still blackened from use. The plaque read simply, "Continuous Feed Welding Gun, Detroit Arsenal, 1942, credited with saving more than 50 million man-hours during World War II. Visitors passed it by, not realizing they were looking at one of the most consequential tools in modern history. Children pressed their faces against the glass, expecting to see a weapon. Instead, they saw a tool that had turned human ingenuity into a force stronger than war. Charles Sorensen never visited the exhibit. Friends said he didn't like museums. "They make things look finished," he once said. "Nothing ever is." But the legacy of his arc, of that first rejected gun, lived on in every welder who picked up a torch, in every engineer who refused to take impossible for an answer, and in every worker who believed that progress, once sparked, could never again be put out. It had become more than a machine. It was an inheritance, a reminder that courage isn't always loud, and that revolutions sometimes begin not with battles, but with the quiet hum of a single spark catching steel. April 1965. The Cold War had reached its fever pitch. The world spoke in the language of rockets, reactors, and radar. But beneath that vocabulary of fear and speed, the invisible backbone of modern civilization remained the same, metal joined to metal, molecule to molecule, by the process one Detroit welder had once built from scrap parts and stubbornness. In that spring, a small notice appeared in the Detroit Free Press. Charles E. Sorensen, pioneer of industrial welding, passed away at his home yesterday, age 73. The article was barely 200 words. No mention of patents, awards, or revolution, only that he had made contributions to wartime production methods. Yet the silence of the obituary masked an extraordinary truth. By the time of his death, more than 70% of the world's manufactured structures, ships, aircraft, bridges, vehicles, relied on gas metal arc welding or its derivatives. His rejected gun had become civilization's most used industrial tool. In government archives, Sorensen's name appeared only in passing footnotes. Ford engineer, 1942, experimental continuous feed welder. Wartime secrecy and corporate anonymity had buried his role so deeply that even official histories credited the invention to committees, not individuals. But among welders and factorymen, the story was legend, told in break rooms, remembered in the rhythm of machines, still using his design. One retired shipyard foreman from Richmond wrote to the American Welding Journal, "I never met Sorensen, but I worked 30 years beside his idea. Every time I pulled a trigger, I thought of the man who gave us time." In those decades, the process had evolved far beyond its humble origin. New shielding gases, automated feeders, and transistorized controls had turned MIG into a family of technologies. TIG, flux core, plasma arc, each carrying traces of his original blueprint. In aerospace, it welded the skeletons of supersonic bombers. In medicine, it sealed the chambers of artificial hearts. What had begun as a wartime necessity had become the signature of progress itself. Governments eventually caught up. In 1967, the U.S. Department of Defense declassified its wartime production studies. Buried in Volume 9 of the Industrial Mobilization Report was a simple sentence. The introduction of automatic inert gas welding in 1942 resulted in a cumulative labor saving exceeding 50 million man-hours across Army, Navy, and Air Corps contracts. No photograph accompanied it. No credit line followed. Just the fact, unadorned, unquestioned, final. For Sorensen, that was all the monument he would have wanted. But time has a way of polishing even the most overlooked stories. In the late 1970s, historians studying wartime industry began piecing together the human chain behind the technology. They found fragments, memos, factory reports, handwritten diagrams. In one archive box labeled Unclassified, Detroit Arsenal, Welding Experiments 1942, they found the original design sketches. A crude drawing of a pistol-shaped handle, wire spool, and gas cylinder. In the margin, a note written in pencil. Wire speed determines current stability. Keep the arc short. CES. By the 1980s, welding societies around the world had begun acknowledging Sorensen's contribution. Technical journals reprinted his diagrams. Trade schools taught his name alongside Edison, Tesla, and Ford. The International Institute of Welding awarded him a posthumous citation for initiating the modern age of automated joining. It was the recognition he never sought, delayed, quiet, and yet complete. Meanwhile, the world his idea had built continued to evolve. Automated robotic arms began to appear on factory floors in Japan and the United States, their movements eerily similar to those of the human welders they replaced. Each robot carried a MIG torch at its wrist, guided by sensors and microprocessors, still following the same principles Sorensen had proven with wire and current 25 years earlier. The circle had closed. The machine that had given humans superhuman efficiency was now teaching machines to work without them. In 1984, a journalist covering the opening of a fully robotic car plant in Ohio asked one of the engineers what he thought of the transition. The man looked at the glowing arc through the safety glass and replied, "That spark has been burning since Detroit 1942. We just made it automatic." Outside, a bronze plaque mounted near the plant's entrance bore the same words etched in steel, in honor of the men and women who turned fire into precision. Theirs was the arc that built a world. By the end of the century, Sorensen's invention had fused continents, industries, and generations. Every oil pipeline stretching across Siberia, every spacecraft frame assembled in Florida, every bridge rising over the Mekong carried a seam that could trace its lineage back to the same continuous arc. And yet the man himself remained a mystery to most, a ghost behind the glass, forever hidden by the light of his own creation. But for those who worked under that light, welders, machinists, engineers, his story endured not as legend, but as example. Proof that innovation doesn't begin in laboratories or boardrooms. It begins in noise, in defiance, in the quiet conviction that a better way must exist, even if no one believes it yet. The torch of that belief was still burning, and the world, whether it knew his name or not, was still following its light. By the dawn of the 21st century, the white-blue arc that Charles Sorensen first ignited in 1942 had become invisible. Not because it vanished, but because it became ordinary. Every skyline, every bridge, every ship that crossed an ocean carried its silent mark. Engineers no longer called it innovation, they called it standard practice. Factories no longer marveled at its efficiency. They measured progress by how many arcs could run without interruption. The rejected gun that once gathered dust in a Detroit workshop had become the foundation of a world where speed was the new virtue and precision the new faith. From the micro-weld sealing pacemakers to the robotic torches stitching the frames of high-speed trains, Sorensen's principle endured, a constant hum beneath the noise of modern civilization. And yet, the story behind it remained strangely human. It was never about machinery alone. It was about defiance, the courage to keep building when everyone else said, enough. The welder who stayed after hours because he couldn't accept wasted motion. The engineer who trusted physics over hierarchy. The workers who adapted, learned, and carried his light forward through war and peace. In 2002, the American Welding Society restored the original continuous feed gun from Detroit Arsenal and placed it on display. Its copper tip was scarred, its trigger worn smooth. Beneath the glass, a small plaque bore his words, recovered from a notebook found decades later. "Progress is what happens when impatience meets precision." That sentence, scribbled in pencil, might as well have been his epitaph. Historians now estimate that Sorensen's process, and its descendants, have saved more than 2 billion man-hours since 1942. The number feels almost meaningless. How do you measure time that no longer needed to be spent? How do you count the hours returned to life itself, to rest, to family, to invention? 50 million man-hours during war became billions during peace, and somewhere in that arithmetic lies the quiet proof that efficiency, when born of necessity, can become compassion in disguise. Factories still echo with his legacy. In the silence after the last shift, when the welders cut their arcs and the fumes drift upward like ghostly banners, the air vibrates faintly, a remnant of current, of history, of a man's refusal to let the ordinary remain unchallenged. There are inventions that roar into existence, loud, celebrated, carried on the shoulders of men who knew they were making history. And then there are the quiet ones, the sparks in a corner workshop, the ideas that begin not with glory but with irritation. Why must this take so long? Why can't it be better? Why? Charles Sorensen never sought recognition. He sought rhythm, the perfect balance between man and machine. He believed that speed and care could coexist, that precision was not the enemy of humanity, but its evolution. His invention didn't just weld metal, it welded eras, the mechanical to the automated, the physical to the electrical, the individual to the collective. Sometimes I imagine him standing there still, helmet raised, watching a line of robotic arms trace light across a modern factory floor. Would he recognize them as his descendants, Or would he smile at how quickly they've outpaced him? How the ark he once tamed has multiplied beyond his imagination? It makes me wonder what kind of courage it takes to create something that will one day forget your name. Perhaps that is the truest measure of impact. Not remembrance, but permanence. The welds he made were never meant to last forever. The idea behind them was. And maybe that's the secret thread running through all progress. A spark that outlives its maker. When we look at the cities around us, at the steel bridges, the aircraft, the silent machines that make our lives possible, we are, in a way, living inside his ark. It hums beneath our feet, unseen, uncredited, but always present. So perhaps the real question isn't whether Charles Sorensen changed history. The evidence is welded into the world itself. The better question is what we choose to do with the time he gave us, those 50 million hours reclaimed from the past. What will we build with them? What ideas will we defend when others call them madness? And when our own sparks fade, will the light we leave behind still hold the shape of belief? Because history, in the end, isn't written in words or names. It's welded, bead by people who refuse to stop creating even when no one is watching.